136th Long Island Progressive Coalition Forum in our monthly Patriot Games series. My name's Bob Frankham, and I'm going to monitor tonight punishment in the immigration and criminal justice systems. Khalil came here as an immigrant at 4 years of age, right? And now he's become a fine citizen, but clearly a success in this country. But he went through some pretty horrible experiences. I'm going to let him enumerate upon those. Then we will.
Thank you. So let me say, first of all, thank you for, even having me here. You know, the work that I do is very much around criminal justice reform, and a part of that is also immigration reform. And in many ways, you know, when people ask you to speak, the first thing that you think about is not monetary gain. The first thing you think about is changing hearts and minds. To expose the information, just like Huntington posted, about the issues and the policies that are negatively impacting some of the people that we walk past every day, some of the people that we may live with, work with, and so on and so forth. So thank you, Bob and Shirley, for inviting me out here. So as Bob introduced me, my name is Khalil Cumberbatch. I'm a resident of New York City, so don't get too scared, right? That's a long way from here. And that's where I grew up at. So my mother and I migrated here in 1986. I was 4 years old, and we migrated from my country of birth, which is Guyana, which is in South America. And since then, I've never went back. All of my family has since migrated from Guyana. So in many ways, I view myself as an American. I view myself as a citizen of this country, even though legally, right, and I use that word very loosely, legally, I'm not a naturalized citizen. So I grew up in Queens. I grew up in a part of Queens called South Jamaica. In South Jamaica, Queens, outside of being famously known and associated with 50 Cent the rapper, was also one of the 7 neighborhoods that have almost decimated and devastated by the drug epidemic in the 80s. And ironically enough, South Jamaica is one of 7 neighborhoods that provides almost 70% of the New York State prison population. Now, that doesn't mean that people in that neighborhood just commit more crimes and so on and so forth. What that means is that obviously those neighborhoods have been decimated, and the resources that they need to get back on their feet have been removed. And as it was mentioned in this video, that there's a mentality that exists that there's always a need to criminalize some form of people, right? And we've seen that in this history of this country. And South Jamaica is one of those neighborhoods that people and residents who live in that neighborhood have been perpetually criminalized and marginalized, and so on and so forth. So growing up in that environment, I was highly susceptible to being funneled into the criminal justice system. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, I was not aware of the bad choices that I was making, but when you give a person limited choices and you have to literally choose the less of 2 evils, we can all agree that they're still both evil, but you just have, you know, you say to yourself that I'm making the best choice that I have, not the best choice that I was given. So at the age of 20, myself and 3 childhood friends committed a robbery in Manhattan, and subsequently we ended up getting into a high-speed chase with the NYPD, the New York City Police Department, and we got into a car crash. And in that car crash was a poor innocent man who was just returning from a job. He was a lounge singer, and we literally T-boned him at around 3 o'clock in the morning, going about 65 miles an hour down Park Avenue. Now, I bring up that part of my case because it's very important to understand that I was at a point in my life where the only person that I solely cared about was Khalil. The only person that I was totally enveloped in making the decisions about, and totally unaware of what my role, what my true role in society was as a young man of color, as a predominant, as someone who had the potential to be a productive citizen. I was totally enveloped in just my own well-being. And committing this robbery was a part of that. And subsequently to the accident, my co-defendants and I were arrested. We were given prison sentences. And my first prison sentence was 11 years of incarceration. Now, this was my first involvement with the criminal justice system. I was a high school graduate. I was working at the time. My lawyer had been able to successfully gather letters of support from family members, community members, from retired police officers. And yet and still, because of the circumstances of the case, the fact that it happened in a very prominent neighborhood, the fact that this man was hurt, I was given an 11-year sentence. I went upstate at the age of 22 and facing a tremendous amount of time. My wife, my current wife, my wife now, and I were we grew up in the same neighborhood. So we were together for this time, and incarceration is a strain, right? Like, you talk about culture shock. No one really prepares you for incarceration. No one really says, hey, welcome to prison, like here's a handbook on how to survive. The reality is that you have to kind of learn it as you go, and if you don't have the right support in place, it can be very hard. So incarceration literally broke our relationship, and my wife and I ended up separating. But it was during my incarceration that I came to a really big epiphany, and this was mind-blowing to me, was that I was not the only person that I should be concerned about. What a novel idea, right? The decisions that I make literally impact other people. Hello. Exactly, right? So, but like, you talk about one of the most, inspiring moments of a person's life is when they have that aha moment in their early 20s. Some people have that aha moment, maybe never. Some people have it, further along their lifeline. Some people have it earlier on. But for me, what was most poignant about that point was that I had that in a maximum security prison. That I had realized that almost 2 years into my incarceration, that the decisions that I made were a part of what led me to go to prison. Now, once I had that epiphany, the next question was, well, what am I going to do with this newfound information? And I was very fortunate to be in a facility that was program rich. It had a ton of programs that were designed and implemented by men who were incarcerated. So it wasn't a state-designed program. There were programs that were created for men in prison to help you deal with your incarceration, but more importantly, to help you deal with your release. And because I was looking at an 11-year sentence, which ultimately got reduced to 8 years, I was in a maximum security prison around people who were serving life sentences. So an 11-year incarceration was something that you didn't necessarily complain out loud about because people were literally looking at spending the rest of their life in prison. And many people had decades already of incarceration, and a person with an 11-year sentence had an opportunity to return back to society. And because I had that opportunity, I was mentored very heavily and very deeply by men who currently are still serving life sentences. And I remember right before I was released that I asked one of my mentors, who had mentored me at this point for about almost 5 years, and I asked him, although he had never been released, right, he was still serving a life sentence, I asked him, I said, Lou, what should I do? Like I have a plan. I mean, I know I don't want to come back to prison, but what should I do? And he told me, he said, well, the first thing you have to do is to remember that you're a representative of us. And the second thing you have to do is to think about your plan that you've been working on for the past 5 years as fluid. Don't look at it as this is my plan, and if I don't execute it, then I'm a failure. Be ready to change your plan as you move. So on February 26, 2010, I was released by the New York State Department of Correction and Community Services. And while they were gracious hosts to me for the previous 6 years, when they gave me an opportunity to leave, I said, yes, I would very much like that. And I took them upon their opportunity, and they released me. And I came home with this very clear understanding that I had a responsibility to not only myself, I had a responsibility to society, I had a responsibility to my family, I had a responsibility to my wife, to my children, and it wasn't a debt. So I want to make that distinction, because I was very clear in understanding that once I was released, my debt that I paid to society was even. what I felt was a deep sense of responsibility because instead of being part of the problem, instead of being part of the solution, I had been a part of the problem up until that point in my life. At least that's what I wholeheartedly believed. So I used all of my experience while I was incarcerated, the fact that I had completed so many programs I can't even begin to even think about them. I had completed 1 year of college. I had remained infraction-free, essentially. I had one infraction for having a fan clipped on a window. And because of all of that, I had got my sentence reduced from 11 years to 8 years. So it was this mentality that I had when I was released, culmination of the past 6.5 years, that I moved forward with rebuilding my life. So one of the first things I did was I got enrolled into college because I understood that once a man is educated, as Frederick Douglass stated, that education makes a man unfit to be a slave. And as Malcolm X said, that he would put prison second to college as a place to go where if a man needs to do some thinking, that he would then be able to do some thinking. And if he's motivated, he can change his life. So the fact that I had both of them, I really didn't have an excuse, right? So I got enrolled into college. I completed my undergraduate in 2 years, and then immediately I got enrolled into a graduate program to complete my MSW. At the same time, I had been working in the field. I had became a case manager for people who were infected with HIV and AIDS, helped them and their families linked to benefits. And then I began working at an agency called College Initiative, where we helped anyone who had criminal justice involvement, we helped them get into college. Now that was the easy part, just getting people enrolled, because doing an application, doing financial aid, those are all tangible things. I like to think that the most work that we did was intangible, where we literally motivated people and changed their perception that higher education is for you. Now many people in the room, including myself, who's accessed higher education, we know the benefit to that. When you talk to a 16-year-old Hispanic male in the South Bronx, who literally has been told in many ways, whether covertly or overtly, that college is not really for you, that you should just do a trade, that aiming for college is just something that is outside of your stratosphere, and that you should not even dare to accomplish that. Talking to someone and then realizing that they have that aha moment, the same one that I had, but instead I had it in a maximum security prison, to realize that they have that, and they had that at the age of 16, at such a young age where their whole life is ahead of them, I would like to think that that's the best work that we did. So in the process of working at College Initiative, I had been able to start my family. My wife and I had another daughter. My wife had a daughter from a previous relationship. So we had 2 young children. My wife was in school. I was in school. And I was 1 week away from graduating with my master's. So I'd already been home for 4 years, had successfully completed parole, had worked with parole department and the probation department in the work that I was doing. So, I was very much on a productive path. I was getting ready to finish. I was getting ready to start a new job. And then March 8th, 2014 happened. And it was on that day, just like any other day, my wife and I woke up very early in the morning. We started getting our children ready. And there was a ring, there was a doorbell, there was a ring at the doorbell. And my wife looks outside the window and she says, "It's the police." So my immediate thought at this point, after 1.5 years of being off of paroles, which is community supervision, my first immediate thought was that the system never really lets you go, right? That no matter what you do, no matter how productive you are, they always find a way to just interject themselves into your life. So because a previous incident had happened very similar to that, where in our previous place of residence, the police department had came to my house to question me about crimes that had happened in the neighborhood solely because of the crime that I was convicted of way over a decade ago. So when they rang the doorbell that morning, that's exactly what I thought that they were going to do. So my wife opened the door. It was police officers that had a vest on that said police. And they said that they were there to conduct an investigation and that they asked us our names. Obviously, this is a law enforcement official, right? I don't have anything to hide, so I told them what my name was, Khalil Cumberbatch. And so they said, well, we're conducting an investigation. We would like to come in and ask you a few questions. So my immediate question was, well, can't we do the question in here? We were in the hallway of our residence. And the officer looked at me and he gave me this kind of answer that said, well, we could do that, but that's like the hard way. The easy way is if you let us in. And he didn't really say that, but he said that with his body language, right? So we let him in, and it was standing in our living room, 3 officers, my wife and I, and our children sleeping in the bed, getting ready to get up, that they told me their real intention, that they told me who they really were, and they told me their real purpose of coming there, is that they came there for me, to serve a warrant, to extract me from my home, because the conviction that I had, very similar to the man mentioned in this short clip, conviction that I had over a decade ago had made my legal permanent residence status, it had put it at risk, and that I had to come with them. But I wasn't to worry, because I would be released that day, that they would advocate for me to their supervisor to give me an ankle bracelet and a bond that I could pay and then be released. So underneath those circumstances and the fact that there were 3 law enforcement officials in my home and I was not going to cause a ruckus with my young daughters in the house, I went with them. So they handcuffed me, put me in the back of a car, and drove me all the way from Springfield Gardens, Queens, all the way to 26 Federal Plaza in Manhattan. And it was in 26 Federal Plaza that the rabbit hole got deeper. That once I got there, they then indeed told me again, they revealed the truth to me, and they said that I wouldn't be released because despite the fact that I had been out for well over 4 years, despite all the things that I had accomplished, all of the steps that I had taken to rebuild a legacy that I was proud of, that the fact that I had committed one crime in this very short frame in a movie called My Life over a decade ago, that I was subject to mandatory detention. So what that meant was that I wasn't eligible for a bond, that no matter what I did in the community, all of the community ties that I had, that I was ineligible and I was subject to detention in one of the facilities very similar to the ones mentioned in the clip. 8 o'clock that night, I was in Hudson County Correctional Center, which is a county jail in Hudson County in New Jersey. And that process began an advocacy movement that ultimately got me out. But before I say that morning when I was leaving, I told my wife, I said, well, you have to call a few people because people are going to obviously want to know why Khalil just disappeared off the face of the earth. My employer, some of my mentors, some of the people that I was working with a consultancy business that I had. So my wife called them. And after I was released and I had conversations with people, 2 things immediately struck them when they heard that I had got arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. One is, Khalil's not a citizen? That's the first thing. And then 2, why Khalil? Like, why him? Like, this is like not the person that you should be doing this to. Like, this guy has been dedicated, he's been doing the work, giving back to his community, raising a family, completing college. And so what they did when they hung up the phone, the first 5 people that my wife called, is that they called everyone else, right? So this is, the community that I work in is a community of advocates and activists and lawyers and people that are just used to just doing stuff, right? When they hear of an injustice, they have to do something. So what they did was they automatically started calling people. They started saying, what's happening here? And ultimately, that led them to an agency called the Immigrant Defense Project. And the Immigrant Defense Project is an agency that is solely focused on the intersection of immigration and criminal justice. Now, 10, 15 years ago, that intersection still existed, but there was nowhere near as much dialogue as there is now about that intersection. So for decades, this country has been deporting people, many of them for low-level offenses, to countries that people have left well over decades ago that they have no real ties to. And in many ways, these people consider the United States of America this is their home. So that's where the Immigrant Defense Project does their work at that intersection. And they immediately got involved in my case. 1, because I had a lot of attributes that they could advocate for, but 2, because this is the work that they do, that they speak to injustices, right? At the point that ICE had picked me up, I was in this country for almost 30 years, right? I came here when I was 4, and they picked me up when I was 33. So I was here for 29 years. And despite all of that, despite that, they still wanted to hold me in mandatory detention. So do we want to show the video, Bob? Okay. So the video that we're going to show was a video that was made as part of my advocacy efforts. That the people that I worked with understood that 2 things. One, that they needed to rally support, and support meaning outside of themselves, that they needed to get people like you involved who are not directly impacted by the issue, but who agree that this is something egregious and this is something inhumane. And 2, to give a visual aspect to what my family was going through. Now, the part that I didn't mention was that my mother had suffered a stroke about a year prior to me being arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So on top of being the main breadwinner for my family financially, being a partner to my wife emotionally, and being there for my kids physically, I also was dealing with the fact of my mother had this physical ailment where she wasn't 100% herself. So this video that we're going to show was that short video, and this is short, I promise. A short video showing my family essentially. And the only part that I have in this video is a phone call that I made from Hudson County. And at this point, I was already detained for almost 60 days. So, and I have to admit that I have not seen this video, and I probably will step out of the room because I still haven't dealt with that, right? So just keep that in mind if you see me kind of run out of here. So the video has my wife, which is Chamika, my oldest daughter, Mia, and my youngest daughter, Ayana. And it's essentially having a conversation with them about what they're going through, the fact that I am physically not there. Exacerbating that is the fact that my wife, whose narrative is way more compelling than mine, because she went through her own, form of trauma, very parallel to mine, is the fact that she literally went overnight from being one of 2 partners in a relationship to being a single mother of 2 young children. And then having the main financial support that you had to be extracted out of the home almost overnight. So not only was she dealing with the 2 young children and
he's amazing. I don't think that there's anybody who's met him that doesn't feel like he captures them, kind of. He's funny. He does everything for me and the girls, and there's nothing that he wouldn't do for his family. Daddy. Mia, Daddy's on the phone. Daddy. Daddy.
Hi, girl.
Hi, Daddy. You want to say hi to your daddy? We don't know how we're paying our bills, or how when's the next time that we'll be able to. I'm afraid of losing our apartment because we've worked so hard to get where we are. He is the glue that holds us together, not only our family, but his mom. And she's been very depressed since he's been gone.
I had a stroke last year, and my son has been with me. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's married, he has his family, but he took care of me, took care of all my medical billing, took care of all my medication, getting all my medication. He would come across and stay with me in the night because I needed constant supervision because I can't help myself. So he would come over and sleep with me some nights. I miss him every day.
Khalil will go over there. He helps her tremendously. He does everything for her, literally everything. That's a big strain for us now because since he's been gone, there's no one really there to look after her, and we don't know how we're gonna do it without him. I need him home. Not only because he's a breadwinner, but because he holds us together. I don't think everything is even enough to tell you what he means. My daughters need him.
It was one of the things that really struck me about Khalil when I first met him was he was very committed and he was very sincere. He'd obviously done a lot of thinking about who he is and where he wants to be, and he was very much committed to that path and a path of change. It's been really my honour to be involved in some way in that journey for him. I feel like I've kind of seen this real transformation over the years that I've known him. What is it, 5 years or so? And in a really deep way, he's kind of the embodiment of my program. He's the success story. He's the student who came in and got to the point of being an advocate, a role model, a change agent.
The loss of Khalil isn't just, a loss to his family, a loss to his community, but the loss of Khalil is a loss to the movement of people that are doing work around social justice. We oftentimes speak that the people that will do this work the best with the greatest integrity are the people that have been directly impacted. And Khalil was that person that did this work with extreme integrity, with extreme passion. And his void is being felt and being missed at this very moment. So we're doing everything we can to bring Khalil back home, but we need your help, please.
So I thought this was a good point to interject the video, because moving forward, then we're going to talk about the efforts that got me out. Throughout this whole thing, I want you to kind of put this in some context, is that Khalil, the fact that I'm standing here and right now in front of you, is very much the exception. Like, this is the exceptional case of one man who had a ton of people behind him, who had a support packet that was literally this thick, almost 100 letters, city council members, two state senators, and just a tremendous push. But the reality is that there are a ton of people, just like Khalil, same circumstances, who are currently being held in detention centers. Yesterday, I had the privilege of sitting in on a bond hearing for someone that I met in immigration detention. And very fortunately, he was granted a bond that his family can afford. But it was only after almost 10 months of being detained. He also has 2 young children who will be able to see their father tonight, so that's a good thing. But yet it took a federal district court judge to intervene and make a ruling in his favor is the only reason that he got a bond. And even after getting a bond, even after being granted a bond hearing, the immigration judge could have still either set a bond that was exorbitantly high, or the immigration judge could have gave him the hearing and said, based on the fact that you have this one conviction, that you're ineligible for bond. So I gave you your bond hearing, but I also denied it to you. you know, thank God that this was a judge who was fair. He listened, and he gave him a bond that his family can afford. But keep in mind that as we look at this, that this video is essentially because I had resources available to me that many people don't. So that's an excellent question. So the warrant that Immigration, Customs Enforcement, or their parent figure, which is Department of Homeland Security, they don't issue, it's not like a criminal or search warrant where they have the right to enter private premises. It's an administrative warrant, which essentially means that if you let them in, then they can conduct a search, they can arrest you, and then ultimately detain you. But for Khalil, someone who had almost 2 years of graduate level study, someone who works in the field of criminal justice reform, someone who believes that law enforcement is important in society, but yet understands that there are many loopholes and many ways of corruption that they operate under, Khalil still didn't understand that if a law enforcement official is standing at my door, I do not have to let him in. That I still wanted to comply, because the other option is something that I just don't want to go down that road at 7 o'clock in the morning with my 2 children in the bed. So there are, and that's with Khalil speaking English as well, right? Because there are a ton of people that come from other countries that English is not their first language. And the fact that a law enforcement official is standing at the door, that means comply 100%. So yes, you don't have to let them in. Although now we're seeing across the country that there are a ton of home raids. So now we're hearing more and more and more that there are a ton of home raids. Immigration Customs Enforcement are illegally entering homes without search warrants, that they have administrative warrants, and yet because they present themselves as law enforcement and they're executing a warrant, people let them in and they run through the house, they handcuff everyone, including young children, which only adds to the trauma, right? Because that's a whole nother part of the conversation that I know we don't have time to delve into, is the unaddressed trauma. So while we're waiting, I'm just going to jump ahead. So the good news is that because of the advocacy efforts, on October 10th, 2014, Department of Homeland Security essentially realized that what myself, my wife, and the community of support that I had, what we were saying on day 1 of my detention, that ultimately, that we were correct. That the government decided that I was not the type of person that they wanted to deport, despite the fact that I had a robbery in the first conviction, despite the fact that I fell underneath this category called aggravated felony, which those crimes don't necessarily have to be aggravated and they don't necessarily have to be felonies. In terms of immigration policies, that's the term that they use. So the crime that I was convicted of and the fact that I fell underneath the category of aggravated felony put me in the same category as someone who is a terrorist, someone who is a threat to national security, so which basically put me at A1 priority. But the government said, despite that, we do not want to deport you back to your country of birth. And they ultimately released me, and not only did they release me, they said that we're going to administratively close the case, which means that for now, we don't want to pursue this, but at any point in your life, at any point we just feel that you are now a priority, that we can then come back into your life and put you through the same exact thing all over again. But of course, just like in 2010, when New York State Department of Community and Corrections offered me an opportunity to go home, I said yes. The same thing happened when they said, well, you can go free. Of course, I wanted to go home to my family. So on October 10th, 2014, at 6 o'clock, 6 p.m., I was able to pick up my youngest daughter from daycare. I was able to go home with my family. I was able to eat dinner with my family. I was able to lie in the same house with my family. But also then understanding very much in the same way that I understood when I was released from state prison in 2010, that I had been given something, right? That I had been given a huge, tremendous responsibility, right? And to whom much is...
It's going to start, okay?
Okay.
The
And...
go away in a minute. So
okay.
Evanescent.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll keep talking while they work on it. So it was very clear to me on October 10th, while I was at home laying in the bed with my family in the house, that I had been given this responsibility, right? And to whom much is given, much is expected. And this immediately began my advocacy work in the intersection of criminal justice and our immigration policies that we have in this country. And since my release in October of 2014, I had been slowly regaining my life back to the point that I had left on May 8th, 2014. And what that means is gainful employment. What that means is being able to cope with some of the emotions that I had of being traumatized for 5 months, being snatched away from my family. Being able to take advantage of opportunities like this, right, where I had the opportunity to come and share my story, but also understand that this is in a larger context of millions of people who've been deported. And to also be a support to my mother and to my wife at the same time, right? So now I work as a policy associate at a non-for-profit agency in Manhattan called the Legal Action Center. And Legal Action Center works with people who have been discriminated against because of criminal justice involvement, HIV and AIDS infection, or substance abuse histories. So, but I also continue my work as in the area of criminal justice and immigration as a consultant with the Immigrant Defense Project. Really figuring out ways where our work overlaps and figuring out ways how to support the advocates on the criminal justice side and the advocates on the immigration policy side. Okay. Again, understand that the context is that, Khalil is very much the exception. Even though I would never say that I am exceptional, I would say that I've been given exceptional opportunities. And those same exceptional opportunities, unfortunately, are not freely given to everyone. And this is a reflection of those opportunities. One of the people that spoke was the executive director of the former agency I worked at, where he talked about that Khalil is essentially the embodiment of what this program is all about, right? And the fact that I've given those opportunities is the fact that he can say that. But I stand here in front of you tonight, and then we'll get into the Q&A session, as a vessel to tell you that right now, while Khalil is here, that there are people all over this country who are not being granted those same opportunities. And that they are not all people who have entered this country undocumented. Because I think when people hear the term immigration, there's this huge connotation with people from Latin America and Central America. But the reality is our current immigration policies, and ever since 1996, our immigration policies have deported millions of legal permanent residents, people that came to this country documented. And it doesn't mean anyone that comes here undocumented is even less than or undeserving. But there's this connotation that we're deporting people that just come here illegally, quote unquote. But the reality is that we are deporting people who are community members, taxpayers, fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, to countries that they have never been to since children. The example of myself, I hadn't been to Guyana since I was 4. If I was to be deported there, I would literally have no one to go to. No one. And despite that, the judge literally did not have the authority to grant me a bond. He literally told me that you would be the prime candidate. But I just literally don't have the authority because of the way that the law is written to grant you a bond, because your conviction, your sole conviction, makes you eligible for mandatory detention and ultimately mandatory deportation. So I thank you for allowing me to share my story, and I guess we can open it up for questions. Wow. Thank you.
Very good to see you. My wife and I used to listen to you on radio every Saturday on the count.
Thank you.
And we saw that you were like a, like the next generation to carry that show to the next level. And then we were extremely disappointed to hear, what had happened to you. The question that I had to ask is, if you didn't have the intervention and support that you had, would you have already been deported, or would you still be in a detention facility somewhere in the United States?
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for your support. On the Count, for those who don't know, is a radio program that also airs on WBAI that's produced and hosted exclusively by people who are formerly incarcerated. And it was founded by a man named Eddie Ellis, who during my detention had passed away. So thank you. So the answer to your question is the average stay for anyone in immigration detention is on average 18 months. Now, we all know averages are generally like in the middle, right? There are people that I've met in immigration detention that were there for 3 years. Now, immigration detention is not a criminal matter. So it's not a criminal procedure that requires you to have certain due process, requires you to be appointed a lawyer if you can't afford one. Immigration proceedings are an administrative process. So you do not have the right to counsel if you cannot afford one. And despite the fact that you have not committed any crime, that they can still hold you indefinitely. So one of the good things about being in prison is that you, for the most part, know one day that something is going to happen, right? Either I'm going to be released, I'm going to be transferred here, or, some people say, well, I know one day that this is where I'm going to die, right? But the indefinite part of immigration detention is what drives you to madness almost. And the fact that the oversight is very little, that's the other part that's so scary. So more than likely, almost 10 months after that, well, almost a year now after they got me, more than likely I would have still been in immigration detention. Fighting to prove a claim, because I was only eligible for asylum. And asylum, when it's what they call reactive, meaning that I've been in this country for so long and I was facing deportation, then I try to put in an asylum claim, it's reactive. And the reactive asylum claim is the most hardest to prove. There were people who were in immigration detention who had came to this country undocumented, who had been here before, got deported, and came back, that literally were able to prove that close family members to them, siblings, had been murdered by either the police department, the government, or some renegade group in their country. And this was the reason why they were coming back into the country. And despite having death certificates and articles and maybe even a written letter from the head of the junta, people were still being deported back to countries where their life was at risk. So I was putting in a reactive claim that on average can take anywhere from 18 to 24 months. Would not have been able to get a bond. My family still would have been struggling. We would have almost inevitably lost the apartment that we were renting. And my kids would have suffered that whole time, right? So while, again, I'm standing here, the reality is that if I wasn't standing here, I probably still would have been in Hudson County. Because going back to Guyana was just like the last option for me. So thank you.
So how do we help?
Please use microphone. Okay, please.
Okay, we'll hold that off again. You mentioned that that this is under a 1996 law. Can you remind us what that law was?
Sure. So in 1996, under President Clinton, they totally revamped immigration policies. Ironically enough, they used the 1996 Oklahoma City bombing as an event to kind of stoke the fears of people. And I say ironically because we all know that that was not done by a foreign-born person, that was done by a United States citizen. But yet and still, we were at a point in our country, much like we were after 9/11, where everyone had a collective fear, and the government felt that these are ways that we can address that fear. So the immigration policies became very, very, very harsh after 1996. And essentially, when that law was passed, it broadened the category of aggravated felony. Now, this term, again, when you hear it, it sounds like, yeah, that's who we should be deporting. But an aggravated felony can be someone who shoplifted, and shoplifting doesn't have to be clothes, it can be food, right? Maybe the person wasn't afford to eat. If they could have shoplifted and they could have been convicted of a misdemeanor, which is not a felony conviction. An A misdemeanor means that a person can be sentenced up to a year, 365 days in a jail. And even if their sentence was suspended, so that means a judge says, you're going to take this misdemeanor, you're eligible for up to 365 days of imprisonment, but we're going to suspend your entire sentence and you can walk home free from the courthouse. That still made you eligible for mandatory detention and mandatory deportation underneath this term aggravated felony. And then, of course, in that term, you have people with robbery convictions and drugs and so on and so forth. And then in 2001, we all know that everything just changed. Our entire way of thinking and our living and our culture in this country and in some ways in this world changed because of September 11th, 2001. So 1996 was when they passed those 2 immigration laws that just dramatically increased the list of crimes that were underneath this term aggravated felony. And what started happening was the government started grabbing people up that fell underneath those categories right off of the 1980s, when we all know that there was a heavy war on drugs, right? So there were a ton of people who had convictions stemming from the 80s that were then being directly impacted by the laws that were changed in 1996.
Quite some story, Khalil.
Yeah, thank you.
Right now, Governor Cuomo is preparing a budget. And in that budget, he included funding for education funding for immigrants. And the head of the state Senate, Dean Skilos, objects to that. He said, we have citizens who have to pay for their education. Why should we pay for illegals and their education? I'm not sure how far that's gone. It upsets me because the jerk doesn't know that we can't, that these people are living in America and they're going to. But anyway, if you had any insight in that or information on it?
Yeah, so the work that I do now, I am very peripherally aware of what's happening with the budget. I was in Albany for 2 weeks in a row about 3 weeks ago. So I do know that there's a ton of push, that the Assembly, for the most part, is in agreement with a lot of the budget, including raise the age, which would remove 16 and 17 rows from adult prisons. But also that the Senate is just as heavily entrenched in getting their agenda pushed forward. So with that said, I had heard this morning that the governor was willing to take that off the table and to table that on a separate issue and not include it in the budget. Similar that he would do the same thing with raise the age. Because these are two issues that politicians in general, both on the Assembly and the Senate, don't feel should be clumped in with the budget. They feel that they should be 2 separate issues where they can have in the House and the Senate to discuss openly. My personal opinion is obviously I think education should be free first 2 years. I mean, maybe that's like pie in the sky thinking. But when we think about what it means for jobs in the economy and what it means for for people being able to compete competitively with other countries, I think it's always important to invest in education. And the reality is that I think that they know that too. But I think that what they also want to create is a class structure where when people aren't educated, they can't get certain living wage. So what that means is that we need, this society is built on the need for people to do jobs like what are considered to be menial jobs, and the majority of people that don't have
really that terrible. I mean,
well, I think that I think that when we think about policy and politics and around issues that we all feel deeply about, I think that we sometimes believe that people on the other side don't really understand what it is that they're doing.
I doubt that.
And I doubt that 100%. I know for a fact that they know exactly what they're doing, and that they use, they use fear tactics, they use language, they use race baiting to encourage. So when this politician says things like, well, why are we funding education for people who come here illegally?
Yeah.
Again, what that is doing is it's very covertly creating a culture of others. So there's like an otherism. So people that, those people are not deserving, but we are. And to lend to that point, even within the immigration rights movement, there are immigration rights advocates who will very quickly throw any immigrant with a criminal conviction underneath the bus. And they say, well, that person committed a crime. You should deport them, but you should not deport the people who come here undocumented because they didn't commit a crime. When the reality is that it's, we shouldn't be amongst ourselves creating that structure of us and them too. Is that, where we should all be advocating for the greater opportunities, whether a person's here undocumented, documented, whether they've committed 1 crime, 20 crimes, right? And it's not about letting people off the hook for personal accountability, but it's about understanding that when we talk about these issues, that it's not about red and blue or black and white or us and them. It's about us collectively as a country and as a society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a question that I think I should know the answer to, but I don't.
I hope I do.
Okay. And I had thought it was 2 aggravated felonies. I guess they changed that. Mm-hmm. I was always under the impression it was 2. If you were to become a citizen, because you have this thing hanging over you still,
mm-hmm.
Are you prohibited from proceeding to becoming a citizen?
So thank you for pointing that out about the 2 aggravated felonies. So what it is on top of aggravated felonies, that term and that category,
right.
If a person has 2 convictions that involve what they call a crime of moral turpitude.
Yes, I know.
Which could literally be like hopping
yes.
a turnstile.
Yeah,
which could literally be
exactly.
like making a left turn, or it could literally be jaywalking.
Right.
2 crimes with that element, and that element is very much open for interpretation.
Yeah.
That they are then also subjected to
deportation.
Mandatory detention and almost inevitable deportation.
Well. Yeah.
So that.
And I guess the secondary question is: do you want to proceed to become a citizen, or is it unnecessary for you?
So for me, in many ways, this is my home, right? I mean, Guyana to me is just my place of birth. I mean, right. I don't know the culture. I don't even subscribe to the culture in many ways. So I would want to go for my citizenship. But one of the things that my lawyer cautioned me about is the fact that once you initiate citizenship application, you have to submit biometrics, which is like fingerprints. And fingerprints, biometrics, can automatically trigger that whole process. Now, obviously, my lawyer feels confident that of the fact that I was in immigration detention. They had me in custody, and they could have moved forward with the process. But the fact that they realized that they didn't want to move forward with the process, he feels strongly that they will not pick back up the case. And the other part that I didn't mention, Bob, is that in December of last year, I was granted a pardon by Governor Cuomo. So I was one of 2 individuals. Thank you. So I was one of 2 individuals, both immigrants, who had criminal convictions. So I was relieved of any collateral consequences that can come from my criminal conviction.
Oh, so you don't have that hanging over your head anymore.
But in terms of immigration policy,
so crazy.
The fact that my crime was committed with a firearm, that element still makes me eligible.
Yes, that's what I want to ask you.
To go through immigration proceedings. The silver lining in that is that because I've granted a pardon, that I would not be eligible for mandatory detention. So that if the immigration proceedings were initiated, that I would have the opportunity to have a bond. Now that bond can be $50,000, it could be $5,000, it can be $1,500, but I would still be able to have a bond that then I would be able to be released and be in this and be in the community and fight my immigration proceedings. So all of that is very much up in the air. But again, it speaks to this idea of never fully being out of the system, right?
No.
Like criminal justice involvement and it doesn't mean criminal justice conviction, it could just mean involvement, is this perpetual cycle, right? And in many ways, it's a perpetual cycle.
Yeah, I wondered why you got 11 years. That's why I wondered if it was an
yeah, I mean, you know, I got, it's a whole nother
probably
story.
had a terrible lawyer, but most likely.
I mean, I had a judge who was you know, like judges in many ways create legacies for themselves, right? And I had a judge who was notoriously known for telling a defendant that if you look out that window, you don't see any trees. And by the time that you are released from prison, there will be redwood oaks outside in full bloom.
Wow.
Basically saying that I'm going to punish you exorbitantly.
Yeah, the maximum.
And this is not something that you want to hear from a judge whose role it is to determine partial justice.
Right.
And that's why many of us that do criminal justice advocacy believe that we should be moving away from calling it the criminal justice system, because the reality is that is the one thing that is lacking in the system is justice. So many of us, especially on the count, exactly. Yeah, many of us and we got this language from Eddie, is that we call it the criminal punishment system, because essentially that's what it's there for, is to punish you perpetually for a crime that you may or may not have to commit.
Because it's so unlimited. I don't want to take up every time. When are you going to go to law school?
That's what my mother asks me all the time. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm so glad I came. As a reader of the Times, I thought I knew something about this topic, and now I realize my knowledge is like just a dust compared to a landslide on a mountain. So anything I say may be so ignorant and non-applicable, but I'd like to ask a question. Is there, your first crime was in New York State, right?
Yeah. Is
there any mechanism now in New York State similar to what President Ford did? He pardoned President Nixon ahead of time. Is there any mechanism in the state that the governor could just say, I now pardon you of all crime that you have done and might do, or anything like that?
So yes, the governor of each state has the executive power to grant clemency, and clemency can mean a few different things. Underneath that term clemency, you can have commutations of sentences. So someone who is in prison serving time, and the governor can say, well, you can be released right now. Doesn't get rid of the felony conviction. And then there are pardons, which essentially says that although you did commit a crime, that you will be relieved of all consequences because of that crime. In New York State, there are 3 reasons that a person can apply for a pardon. And one of them is to grant re-entry back into the United States or to prevent removal from the United States. So that was the opportunity that my family and my lawyer and the advocates took advantage of, is to submit a pardon application on my behalf to prevent my removal from. Now, Governor Cuomo, unlike some other governors in the country, has only pardoned 5 people in his entire first term. Only 5, and in his first 2 years, he didn't pardon any. Now, the governor in his second term, which is going to be undoubtedly his last term, has committed to applying more pardons. And as a matter of fact, when they pardoned, when it was myself and the other individual who received pardons, they also created a website where a person can go on and log in and created an online application with the idea that they want to increase the amount of people that are getting pardon applications. So yes, the governor can do more. Obviously, yes, he should do more, because there are a ton of people that are facing immigration consequences, but also other consequences from criminal convictions. But that is one avenue that the governor has, that he can say, we will pardon you, including people in prison and in detention centers, to be released and not have to face consequences from criminal convictions. Remiss if I did not at least counter that point. So when Bob reached out to me and said, Khalil, can you come out here to the Long Island Progressive Coalition and to talk about your story? And the first thing I thought about was, I'm going to tell my story in the context of the larger story, right? So I do not want money. If you do want to give money, you can help to donate to agencies like the Immigrant Defense Project, like any other immigrant rights agency that is doing great work representing people. Legal Aid Society, Brooklyn Defender Services, and Bronx Defenders have formed a consortium called the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project. And what they are doing is the second model in the country where they are giving free representation to anyone who is being detained for immigration proceedings. If you want to give money, donate to those agencies, because the people that they are helping are being tremendously helped. And to speak to that point, there was a study that was done to help fund this project, the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project. And they found that if a person is detained with no representation, which many people are because they cannot afford an immigration lawyer, they have a 3% chance of winning their case. 3%. Once they receive the lawyer, same case, once they receive the lawyer still in detention, their chances of winning their case jump to 67%. Those are the people that definitely need it, and that if you do want to donate, that you can. That's the tangible way. The intangible way is that you can donate to LIPC, right? I mean, to help fund speakers to get people to come out here and talk. But then also to continue this conversation, because I think it's very easy to preach to the choir, and I think the choir is really important to preach to because they need to keep going. But also, too, to have these uncomfortable conversations at whether it's in this room, the living room, the dining room, or a ballroom, to question people, right? Because I work with people who say some of the craziest things, right? They say things like, well, if someone comes here illegally, then they should be deported. And it's so easy to just say, you know what, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say anything about that. But it is really important, at least from my perspective, to question people on that and say, well, where are you getting that from, right? And as Malcolm X said, when you're in a dining room and someone invites you to the house for dinner, and everyone at the dining table is drinking dirty water, the one thing that you cannot do is slap the water out of their hand and say, that's dirty water. The alternative is to present the clean glass of water and to let the clean glass of water speak for itself. So a very easy way of doing that is to question people and say, well, where are you getting that from, right? Aren't these human beings? Today in the New York Times, there was an article that talked about the expansion of private prisons in immigration detention. And they talk about women and children being detained and treated as if they are criminals, when the only thing that they've ever done is to come to this country, that they are hoping that they can be saved from the violence that, by the way, was mainly brewed up because of our international policies in a lot of these countries, in policies like NAFTA, like what we did in Ecuador and Nicaragua, the same triangle that a lot of these people are running from, the violence that still exists, that these are human beings that are really the result of our decisions that we made as a country decades ago. And now it is us collectively that we have the ability, the same way we got into it, is to get out of it. But the only way it's going to happen is if we question people, if we constantly are being that pillar of light. So thank you.
Khalil?
Yes.
What's the name of that defense fund?
So it's the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, NYIFUP. And it is Bronx Defenders, Legal Aid Society, and Brooklyn Defender Services. So I encourage you, because I don't want to come here and say, yes, Khalil, yes. Again, this is really about Khalil sharing his story, but also understanding that tonight there are a lot of people that are not going to be able to go home. In the same way that I was calling my kids and trying to console them in 15 minutes, the same way that some people are going to have to do that tonight, or maybe not do it at all, because those phone calls are expensive. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalil. I think people would agree with me that this is the finest presentation we've had in a long time, if maybe ever in our history. Thank you so much. Thank you. Talk about a class act. You know. Thank you very much. Okay.